Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. To start this off like I normally would, my name is Christopher Harrison. I'm a senior program manager at Microsoft Cloud and AI. You can find me on Twitter and basically any other social media platform at Geek Trainer. And today I want to talk about Flask. So in this video here, what I'm going to do is to introduce the core concepts of Flask and highlight one of the more common scenarios that you would decide to go ahead and use Flask for. Which begs the question then, well, what is Flask? Well, Flask is, as the website would tell you, it is a micro framework for web dev. So if we break this down real quick here, micro of course meaning small, and framework being a built set of tools that I can go ahead and use, it's a small set of tools. And that really is Flask's great power. Flask will do exactly what we want for a web application and nothing else. That if we consider something like Django, which if you know anything about me, you know that I'm a huge fan of, Django does a lot of things out of the box for us. It has an ORM, it has an admin site, it has built-in authentication and authorization capabilities, it will automatically generate HTML for you, and so forth. And all of that's great if that's what you want. But the problem, of course, is getting things up and running inside of Django requires a little bit more knowledge about what's going on behind the scenes. So like the initial learning curve can be a little bit higher. And you're also going to notice that to truly take advantage of Django, that you have to do things in a particular way. And again, not necessarily a bad thing if that's what you're looking to do. But let's say that what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to put a web front end in front of some different services that I want to be able to call behind the scenes. So for example, maybe I've got some AI services, or maybe I've got an ML model that I want people to be able to access. So this back here is really the core of what it is that I'm trying to build. And the front end doesn't need to be overly complex. So maybe I don't necessarily need authentication. Or if I do, I could go ahead and add it on later. Or maybe I don't necessarily need to work with a database. But if I do, that I could go ahead and add that on later. That if really what I'm looking for is a front end to a web app, and that's it, Flask is going to give me exactly that. And so we're going to see here that Flask will give us the ability to set up all of our different routes. We'll talk about what routes are in a minute, but basically it's going to be that user makes a request and we can run some code in response to that. It's going to give us a wonderful templating engine, so that way I can dynamically generate my HTML. And it's also going to have a couple of core little features that'll be built in, like the ability to serve up static files without me having to really go in and set anything else up. And so that's really it. And so the beauty here is that Flask is going to get out of my way. And so we're going to see at the very end here that I'll be able to call services that are, hosted somewhere else, or, maybe on a different service or whatever it is, without having to try and figure out how I'm going to like inject this into some class or flow into some event-based architecture or something like that. That it's just, hey, user looks for this. I'm going to take some value. I'm going to send it out to this service, get the response, put it out, and then send it out from there. This is, of course, not to say that I can't create large websites with Flask. I absolutely can. But where Flask really shines is when I'm looking for a straightforward front end that I want to be able to focus in on my back-end services. This is really where the magic is going to happen. I just need a UI. Flask is perfect for those scenarios. So let's get in and take a look at how we're going to install Flask. So what I've got here is, of course, Visual Studio Code. I love Visual Studio Code, and I've created an empty folder here. Now, there's nothing else that's been installed, nothing that's fancy here, etc. It's just an empty folder, nothing up my sleeves except for my arms. You are going to notice, if you peek down at the bottom left, that I am using WSL, or specifically WSL2, which is the Windows subsystem for Linux. Honestly, I do all of my dev work using WSL, and the reason for that is because services or platforms or programming languages like Python or Node.js are really built with Python with Linux in mind, and I like that ability just to be able to sort of work with Python in the environment, in the operating system that it was really designed to target. That I find that the tooling just works a little bit better. I find that the documentation aligns a little bit better, etc. Like it's a happier experience here, and especially with WSL2 being able to go back and forth relatively easily between WSL and Windows. The great integration that we get with VS Code really just makes this shine. So you're going to notice that I'll be using Linux here. Just going to clear out my screen. I was just playing with other things. I deleted all of it. So again, empty folder here. But you're going to notice I'll be writing everything in Linux, but everything that I'll be doing would also work inside of Windows. The syntax might be slightly different as far as the commands go, but again, it's still going to be Flask. Okay. So the first thing that we want to do, as always, is we want to go ahead and create a virtual environment. And that's going to be the command to do that, tick mvenv. That will create my venv folder, and then I'm going to go ahead and bin activate, enable that. I do want to mention that I did record a video, and I'll make sure that we get it linked in the description below, to help explain how virtual environments work. So if you're interested in digging a little bit deeper there, you can go ahead and see all of that there. Okay. Now, I am going to need to install a couple of libraries here. And I'm going to list that out inside of my requirements text file. If you're not familiar with the requirements text, it's sort of the convention for listing out all of the Python libraries that you want to have installed. So I, of course, want Flask. Might have sort of guessed that. I'm going to want python.env. And I'm going to grab this one just because I sort of know where I'm going with the demos, and that eventually here I'm going to need a key to access a service. And so I want to make sure that I'm not going to hard code that in. And so I always do this by using .env. .env, as we'll see, is sort of a good enough way of protecting your keys and to make sure that you're not going to accidentally publish them out to GitHub. Because your security tip for the day is, as a general rule, publishing usernames and passwords to a publicly available website, generally not a good idea. So let's not do that. So .env helps me to avoid that. And then last but not least is I'm going to grab Azure Cognitive Services Vision, computer vision. And what that last one is going to be is it's going to be the SDK for a little service inside of Azure called Computer Vision that we'll go ahead and take advantage of when we go into introduce a service. So I'm just installing all of it now just to make my life a little bit easier. And this is going to be done pip tick R requirement, pip install R, and then my requirements text file. Okay, so this will go ahead and install all of those packages. And I do want to mention the fact that all of this will be available inside of GitHub. And again, the link will be in the description below. Okay, let me go ahead and now create my app.py file here. And let's make sure that my Python interpreter is selected here. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, that's good. All right, I don't know why it's giving me that little error message here. I'm good. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say from Flask import Flask. Okay, it is going to give me a little error message. Not a problem. Let me okay, there we go. All right. Yeah, for some reason, Visual Studio is just not finding the virtual environment, so I just had to fix that real quick, and that's what I was doing down there. Okay, cool. Now let's get back to our code. So what you're going to notice here is that I'm going to import Flask from Flask. So Flask, of course, being the name of the library, and then Flask here is the core object for Flask. There'll be a couple of other items that we'll go back and grab a little bit later on, but for right now, that'll be the core. And then I'm going to go ahead and say app equals Flask and then name. So what am I doing here? What I'm doing is I'm actually creating my Flask app, or maybe server if you want to use that terminology instead. This is now going to become the core of everything that I'm going to be doing inside of Flask. So anytime that I need to talk to my core application, maybe configure different settings, how I want it to run, etc., all of that's going to be done off of that app object. The thing that we're going to be using that for will be to set up our routes, which then begs the next question of what is a route and how do we configure one? Okay, so let me go ahead and create a real quick route here. And then I'm going to talk about what it is that we're doing. So what I'm doing is I'm creating the core hello world here. And the syntax that you're seeing here is me creating a route. So again, what is a route? Well, let's back things up and let's talk a little bit about how the web works. And as it turns out, there's no magic. There's no magic in how the web works. That if you think about, say, like a smartphone app, when somebody clicks on a button, some bit of code is going to execute behind the scenes. Makes sense, right? Well, if you're creating that app, then what you're going to do is you're going to configure it such that when somebody clicks on a button, that there's going to be some bit of code that we're going to run behind the scenes. Again, that kind of makes sense. User clicks on a button, I need to respond to that inside of my application. I want to make sure that some code is going to be executed. Away we go from there. That's how it works when I'm working with a smartphone app. Well, as it turns out, web dev is actually no different. That in web dev, I'm going to execute code in response to the user making a request. Now, how is that user going to make a request? Well, at the core of it, the way that the user is going to make a request is by sending a URL. Now, that URL, how that's going to be built is going to vary. Sometimes it might be that the user types it in. So they go to whatever your website is, so adventureworks.com, and that's how the URL is entered. Sometimes it's going to be that they click on a link. And that will then take them to some particular page because, again, the URL will be updated. Or they might be clicking on a button, and that then is going to take them somewhere. And it might also update the way that information is going to be sent up. All of those different things, all of those different ways of setting up URLs still all come down to one core concept. And that is that the user is giving us a URL. That's how they're indicating what it is that they're trying to do. That's how it is they're going to indicate the information that they're looking to access. And so when I create my web application, I'm going to look for specific URLs, specific information inside of those URLs, maybe how it is that the user came to that URL, and then respond accordingly. So effectively what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, if the user gives me this URL, if they type this in, if they click on a link, however it is, this is how I want you to respond. This is the function that I want you to now execute. This is the code that I now want you to run in response to that request. That is the core of routing. That's what routing is all about. That this URL, run this function. This URL, run this function. This URL, run this function. That's it. So in my case here, my URL is just simply /. So if the user just types in whatever my website name happens to be and nothing after it, this is now what is going to execute in response to that. Now, the name of the function here, theoretically, is arbitrary. That you could really call it whatever it is that you might want. You'll notice that I called it index originally because that is sort of convention, that whatever your starting point is, we're going to go ahead and call that as index. But you could technically name it whatever it is that you want. It does not matter. So you could just go ahead and call it Wibble. It'll work fine. Don't do that though. And the reason that you don't want to do that, of course, is not only A, because it's going to make it a little bit more confusing for somebody to be able to navigate, but also B, that, or I should restate that, not for the user. I apologize. Let me restate that. A, because it's going to make it a little more confusing for the developer when they come along and look at this. The user will never see index. They're never going to know what that is. But the developer will. And so if I'm calling this Wibble, that doesn't make any sense. So I want to make sure that it's going to be nice and clear. The other big reason is if we want to be able to dynamically build URLs, which we're going to want to do as part of our application, we are going to need to know the name of the function, that this is the way that we're going to be able to access this eventually. And so if the name of our function doesn't make any sense, it's going to make it that much harder to program against that later on. So good consistent naming here, best practice. So calling this index, since that is traditionally the entry point, is exactly what we want to do here. Okay. The last thing then that you're going to notice is that we're just going to return a string value here. So our string value is now going to be returned back, and eventually, as we're going to see, we'll be able to display that inside of a browser. Now, needless to say, we probably don't want to stick to just doing a whole bunch of string concatenation for HTML. Partly because there's security issues there, especially if you're going to be working with data that might be sent up from the user, but also because of the fact that it would just be, really difficult to program against. So we are going to take a look at the templating engine that's available through Flask, a little thing called Jinja, that will help make it easier for me to then build all of this without having to do a whole bunch of just string concatenation. That's normally where you would go. But before we get there, tradition, let's go ahead and do Hello World. Okay, so now let me just bring back up my terminal window here, and I'm going to do two things in here. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say set, whoops, not set, that's Windows, export, that's Linux, Flask env equals development. So what that's going to do there is that's going to set a system variable called Flask env that will tell Flask when it runs to run in a debug or developer mode. So now every time that I save this app file, it will automatically restart the server for me. I'll still need to refresh the page, but at the very least, my server will now refresh. So it's great for doing development, and obviously it's also great for doing demonstrations as well, because now whenever I make a change, I don't have to keep stopping and restarting my my service. That I can just go ahead and let it go from there. Okay, cool. So now that I've got my my dev environment set, let me go ahead and run my application by saying Flask Run. And you're going to notice that it will tell me that it's available on 127.0.0.1:5000. That is the default location. And if I do a control click, it'll actually automatically open up in my browser. Let me display my browser window here. And sure enough, you're going to notice that this is now displaying out Hello World. Cool. Okay. So from here, we've now got our core route set up at /, and that's actually going to work just fine for us. We could get fancier than this. I'm also going to mention the fact that we have another video about Flask where we talk an awful lot more about routing and really flesh out a larger application. We had about 2 hours there, so it just gave us more time to go in and play there. So if you're curious more about routing, you can check the docs or go check that that video. That there's a lot more obviously to routing than just setting up that 1//. But again, for our application for right now, it's going to work just fine. Instead, what I want to do is I want to turn my attention to Jinja Templates and how we can create a little bit of dynamic HTML here. Now, again, I could theoretically do that with a whole bunch of string literals and things like that, but again, that's bad. It's not the way that we want to do this. So instead, what we want to do is we want to take advantage of the templating engine that that Flask has for us, which is called Jinja Templates. So I'm just going to let this come up here, give this just a moment. There we go. So here is our Jinja Templates. Now, the first thing that I want to highlight about Jinja Templates is the fact that at its core, it's HTML. And I contrast this with something like Pug, which is popular in the Express space, which is very much not HTML. That it's designed to be very terse, all based on like tabbing and things like that. And a lot of developers love it. I'm not here to bash it, but it doesn't necessarily work from my brain. That I've been doing web development for quite a long time now. I think in HTML. It's just, this is where my brain goes. And so I really like the fact that at its core, it's HTML. What I also really like about Jinja is its syntax is relatively similar to a lot of other templating engines that are available. That if you've used something like Angular, if you've used maybe Ruby on Rails, if you've done Django even, that all of this will look relatively familiar to you. That curly brace syntax to indicate, hey, I want to take something and put this here is relatively common across a lot of different platforms. So if you've used one of those, then making the migration here is going to feel relatively natural. And if you haven't used one of those before, you'll still very likely feel relatively at home here because of the fact that this is, again, at its core, HTML. That is what this is at its core. It's HTML. So let's go ahead then and see how we could set up a Jinja template. So I'm going to create a brand new folder called Templates. Very creative name there. And I'm going to create a brand new file here that I'm just going to call index.html. Because, again, it's really an HTML file. There's going to be some special things in there, but it's an HTML file. And that's what's wonderful. So I'm going to use the little abbreviation here for HTML just to have it create a core HTML file. And you're going to notice that I'll be able to set up a title, of course, in here. And I'm just going to call this dog or no dog, like that. Sort of hinting at where I'm going with all of this. And then inside of my body, I'm going to go ahead for right now and just hard code in hello world. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come back, don't worry, and make this a little bit fancier. But for right now, I'm just going to hard code in hello world. So now what I want to do is, instead of returning a string, which is what I had a second ago, instead what I want to do is I want to return back that HTML template. And the way that we do this in Flask is by using render template. So what render template will do is it will, instead of just returning back a string, is it will open up that Jinja template, that HTML file that we've created, and return that back. So I'm going to say return render template, and I'm going to say index.html. You'll notice, of course, that that matches the name of the file that we created. And that file, again, is inside of a templates folder. So that's where that's going to be. So let me go ahead and save that. And now if I come back over to my browser here and I hit refresh, now what you're going to notice is the fact that this says hello world, but it's now in an H1. And I can actually see that if I just bring up the developer tools here and I just click on that little item, you're going to notice, or just mouse over it, you're going to notice that it tells me that's an H1. So it's now running our template. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Christopher, that's just a static HTML file. Okay, fine, you're right. It is just a static HTML file. But I can go ahead and pass information into that static HTML file. And the way that I pass information into that is just by using a keyword argument. So the keyword, or whatever parameter name it is that I choose here, is now automatically going to become a variable for that template. So I could go ahead and say something like this. I could say message equals, and I'm just going to say hi there, for example. Or maybe hello Jinja, just to make it a little bit different. Cool. So now that's going to be passed into the template. And so if we stop and think about this, now what I could go ahead and do, instead of my little hello world here, Now what I could do instead is go grab that message. Now the way that we're going to grab a variable and print it out, and that's going to be the key here, that we're going to print it out, is we're going to use two curly braces. So whatever it is that's inside of two curly braces here, that is going to automatically take whatever happened to be inside of there and print that out onto the screen. So it's sort of a shortcut in like JavaScript terms for like a document.write, or maybe in another platform, say like ASP.NET, a shortcut for like response.write, etc. So it's just automatically going to take whatever is there and print that out. So in our case, that's going to be message. So now this is going to display out that message inside of the HTML. So now that I've got that set up, I've hit save. Let me come back over here to my browser. I'm going to hit refresh. And now you're going to notice that it tells me hello Jinja. Because again, that was the value that I passed into there. So pretty cool. So now what I've got going on here is I've now got this little bit of dynamic capability. Now, it's also worth highlighting the fact that it does not have to be simply a string literal here, that in my example of app.py, I specifically said message equals hello Jinja. Well, what happens if I want to be able to read something that the user had sent in, or maybe I'm going to be running some code or something like that? You could absolutely have some variable. So I'm just going to say message equals some variable because I'm very creative here. And then go ahead and print that out. And so now when I go ahead and I save that and come back over to my browser and hit refresh, there we go. Now you're going to notice some variable. So again, it could be built out dynamically, however it is that that you might want to be able to do that. Okay. Now, up until this point, everything that we've done has been either that we're going to execute some bit of code, dynamically build up a string and send that out, or that we've set up a template and then we've sent it out that way. But of course, we're probably going to want something better than this default display. We're probably going to want JavaScript files. We're probably going to want some CSS files. Heck, we might even have a need for some static HTML pages. So the question then becomes, well, how do we then serve static content? So one really nice thing that our Flask is going to offer to us is a great convention for managing our static files. That's sort of like all of my templates go into a folder called templates. Our static files are going to go into a folder called, wait for it, take a guess. If you guess static, you're absolutely right. If you guess dynamic, probably maybe have a quick conversation here. Yeah, so it's going to go into a folder called static. Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a very fancy CSS file here, site.css, and I'm going to go ahead and bind this up to the body, and I'm going to say my font family is going to be Verdana. And what we're going to notice here is if I go back to my browser, I want you to notice that this is a serif font, which basically just means that there's feet on it. The little lines that you see underneath or to the sides of different characters, it's a serif font. Sans serif font, which is what Verdana is, will get rid of those. So that's what we're going to wind up seeing when we go back to refresh our page here in a minute. Now, if I go back to my index.html and I want to now reference that style sheet, the way that I reference a style sheet is link rel equals style sheet, and then href equals, and then whatever my URL happens to be. Now, the catch is that it's possible that I might want to choose a different file or a different folder name for all of my static files. That maybe for whatever reason I do want to call that folder dynamic. Please don't do that. But maybe I did. I don't know. Or maybe you want to put it somewhere else, or maybe you're migrating, or who knows, whatever it is. But you might have a need to rename that folder. Well, you can go in and set the configuration to change that that static folder name if you so desire. So as a result, you're going to notice that I don't have the ability to simply go to, you know, my site /static/ and then whatever it is. Flask is going to protect that. And that's actually a really good thing. That Flask is not going to serve up any file by just allowing a user to access that dynamically. Never. That's a good thing. Instead, what needs to happen is I need to have Flask build an appropriate URL for me, and then that URL will be able to be used by the user to be able to access this site. Now, the way that we're going to generate that URL is by saying curly curly. Again, that's going to take whatever's there and just print it out. And then I'm going to say URL 4. So URL 4, as you might imagine, will generate a URL for something. What's that something? Well, in my case, that something is going to be static. This is built in. You're going to notice that all I did here is I created a folder called static, put a file into it. That's it. I didn't configure anything else for static. This is the built-in behavior here. So now I'm going to add in one parameter, which is going to be file name equals, and then my case, site.css. So static is basically me telling Flask, hey, I'm going to be serving up a static file here, give me a link. And then file name is going to be me telling Flask, hey, this is the name of the file that I wish to serve up. So when this is executed, this is all going to be built up on the server. It's going to generate that URL for me, and then it will be able to be referenced just like a normal style sheet. So now when I hit save and I come back over here to my browser, you're going to notice like the little feet that you see here, all of those are going to go away. So let me go ahead and hit refresh, and the font has changed. It's now Verdana. Now, if I bring up F12 here and I go to my HTML, see, can I make that a little bigger? I can. Cool. Okay. Okay. Over here is the HTML, and so it went ahead and generated, in this case here, that /static whack site.css. So it's generated that URL for me. Now, again, theoretically, I could have gone ahead and just gone this direction. Don't do that though. Don't do that. Always, 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 always use that URL for and let it generate it for you, because now I'm telling Flask, hey, this is okay to be served up. Always, always, always URL for. That's the way that this is going to work. Okay, cool, cool, cool. So now let's go ahead and come back over to our application and let's add a little bit of life into this. So up until now, what I've been focused in on is building out our starter app for our little site here. Now, again, you can absolutely use Flask for building huge applications. But where Flask really shines is for when what I'm looking to do is to take some external service and put a web front end in front of that. And so that is now what I want to turn my attention to. That's what I want to do here. And so what I want to do is I want to take advantage of a little service inside of Azure Cognitive Services called Computer Vision. Now, I'm using Computer Vision not because I work for Microsoft, although I do, but rather just because I want a representational, I want a service that I can call. That's really what I'm looking for here. And so this will allow me to go ahead and go grab a service and show how we can incorporate that. So that's what I'm gonna do here. So I'm going to start this, again, sort of a nothing up my sleeves except for my arms type of situation by going into my Azure account, and I'm going to create a brand new resource for Cognitive Services. Now, Cognitive Services is our name for all of our AI services. So things like natural language processing, things like computer vision, which will be able to tell you something about a picture, for example, like whether or not there's a dog in the picture, which is, you know, what I'm looking to do here, or if I'm looking for sentiment analysis. So maybe I want to take a look at some text, figure out what it is that the user was feeling, if it's, you know, positive, negative, those types of things. All of that is inside of Cognitive Services. So I'm going to hit create. And then I'm going to give this a name of Flask Demo because I'm very creative with my naming. I'm going to set my location as West US 2. One real quick little performance tip for anybody who uses Azure is make sure any services that are going to be talking to one another are always inside of the same location. So that way you're not having to cross location boundaries. I'm going to go ahead and use the pricing tier of S0. If you're curious about the pricing for Cognitive Services, you can go check all of that out. In my case here, I'm going to be using Computer Vision, and you're going to notice that it will be $1 per 1,000 transactions in my case. So 10 transactions to get to a penny is going to be the pricing there, which will be just fine. It's going to ask me for a resource group, which I'm just going to use demo. Confirm that I've read the notice there, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit create. This will take it just a second, which will give me an opportunity to have a sip of water. Cool. Okay. So now let me go to my little resource here. And then I'm going to, first of all, go to overview. Now there's going to be a couple of pieces of information that I'm going to need. The first thing that I'm going to need is the endpoint, which is basically where do we need to call to. And then the second thing that I'm going to need is my keys here. And so my keys are going to be effectively my passwords. And so that's the way that you want to treat them. You want to treat them as your passwords. So obviously doing something like this, displaying this in clear text to everybody that's watching, not a good practice, but that's okay. I'm going to go in and delete this right after we're done here, so nobody's going to be able to access this anyway. I do want to mention, though, that you do have the ability to regenerate the keys. There's actually no difference between key 1 and key 2. The only reason that there's 2 keys is simply because it will allow me to change one but be using the other. So that way, as I recycle through my keys, I can make sure that I'm doing that without causing any downtime there. So that's why you have the 2 keys. So I'm going to go ahead and copy one of those into my clipboard. Okay. So now let's go back to our code and let's add in that service. So I'm going to use the SDK that's available to me. So I'm going to say from Azure, Cognitive Services, Vision, Computer Vision, import Computer Vision Client. And then I'm going to say from MS REST and authentication, import Cognitive Services credentials. Okay, so that first class, that's going to be the client that we're going to use to make the calls. The second class there of my of the credentials, that's going to be used to convert the key into something that the client will be able to use. Which then of course means that I'm going to need the URL and I'm going to need that key. Remember what we were talking about before? Hard coding those things in? Bad idea? Bad idea. So instead, I'm going to use .env. And the way that .env is going to work is it's going to look for a file called .env. And it's going to be looking for key value pairs. So I'm going to say cog svcs endpoint, and we'll paste in the endpoint. And I'm going to say cog svcs key, and I'm going to paste in the key here. Okay, so now if I was going to be, say, setting this up as a Git repository, I can then make sure that I add .env to my gitignore file, and now this isn't going to be published out. Now, of course, this is still a text file. And this is going to be a text file that's going to be stored locally on my computer, and it's going to have all of those keys. So there is still a potential risk here of this being shared out. I'm not going to lie about that. But it's going to be stored locally on my system. I'm using BitLocker. So as long as a hacker doesn't get into my system, although I'd argue at that point, if somebody gains admin access to your box, it's all over anyway. Even if they had physical access, they're not going to be able to do anything with it because, again, you know, I've got BitLocker. But that being said, you might still want a little bit of a belt and suspenders approach here. You might want to go ahead and actually encrypt this file and so forth and so on. And you will notice that .env is actually not unique to Python, that it's available for a whole host of different platforms, and that there are also extensions to it that will allow you to encrypt that file. So if you are looking for just like a little bit more protection, you can absolutely go ahead and get that. I like .env because I find it sort of walks a nice middle ground of being secure enough for most situations, but still being pretty straightforward to go ahead and use. That to use it, what I'm going to do is say from .env import load.env, and then I'm going to say load.env. So this will read the .env file and then automatically put all of those keys in as environmental variables. So I can now access them off of os.getEnv and whatever the key names happen to be. So I'm going to go ahead and now create my client. So I'm going to say client equals computer vision client. It's going to want my endpoint os get env and then cog svcs endpoint, and then it's going to want my credential os.get env key. Okay. So now that I've got my client, let's come back to the index, and I'm actually just going to comment out what we had before, because now I want to make this a bit more robust here. Now, what I want to do is I want to set up a form, and I want to check to see whether or not there's a dog in a picture. So I'm going to allow the user to upload a picture. I'm going to send it out to Cog Services, and then I'm going to come back and go, hey, was there a dog inside of this? Now, if we think about a form and the normal flow here, the way that this typically works is that the user requests it by getting a URL. So they're going to, link or type in the URL, and it's going to give them the form back. They're then going to fill out the form, and then they're going to click submit, and then all of that information is going to be sent back. Now, the way that that interaction is going to work is we're going to display the form through a process of what's known as a get, and then the user is going to send back all of that information through a process that's known as post. So get means, hey, give me the form. Post means we're going to send it back. Those are known as methods. So what I need to do first is I need to say, hey, we want this to work for both get and for post. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my code here where I'm going to say if my request, got to make sure that I add that in up here, request, there we go. If request method equals get, then this is going to mean they're requesting the form. So I'm going to say return render template form.html. Otherwise, request method post, and then in this case, they've sent the form. So now we're going to do something with whatever happens to be inside of the data. So we'll make the appropriate call, and then eventually we'll say return render template. And then we'll go ahead and say, let's just say like result.html, and then we'll maybe just go message equals message, like that. Okay, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'll leave it like that. Okay, I'll just rename something here in a minute. Okay, cool. So there is that normal flow. Now, one real quick thing I want to mention, and the Flask website is going to mention this, is there is this little thing known as Csrf, and you can go, fire up your favorite search engine and do a little bit more research on that. But Csrf is where somebody could fake that they're submitting this form through your site. And this could potentially allow them to do bad things to your site is the short version of that. Now, again, everything is risk assessment. In my case, all that's going to happen is all that my code is going to do is they're just going to take the image and they're going to send that up to a cognitive service. And this might actually be something that I might have as a REST endpoint anyway. So the fact that that's a possibility might not be an issue. Or again, maybe I'm just doing a little bit of testing. And if that's the case, again, maybe this isn't an issue. But if this is an issue, if you do care about security, you will want to go grab a plugin that's going to handle that for you. Again, if you go check the other Flask video that I did, we'll talk a little bit more about that in there. So you could go check that out if you want a bit more information. Okay, now what I'm going to do is off of my request object. My request object is going to give me the information that the user has sent to me, to my application. And off of there, I'm going to have a collection here called files. And files is going to contain anything that was sent up by using the file dialog in HTML. And so I could go ahead and just grab this from a collection. In my case, I'm just going to say image. So this is going to contain the image that the user sent via the form. Okay, well, what is the form going to look like then? Let's go build that real quick. So let me go to my templates here and form.html and HTML5, boom, and dog or no dog. And let's go ahead and say here, div upload a picture, and we'll tell you if there's a dog. Okay, and then let's set up a form. Cool. Okay, that looks good. So what I've got here is I've got my form set up and I've got my input type equals file right here. So this is a built-in HTML control that will give you a file picker and allow you to upload a file. So let me go ahead and save that. Now, one very important thing is in order for this to work, and this is key here, in order for this to work, your encoding type needs to be multi-part WAC form-data. That is required to make this happen. So here's going to be that form. So that's what's now going to display out to the user. When the user hits submit here, it's now going to go up by post. And this file, you'll notice name of image, is now going to be what's going to be available to me right here. So that's how that link is going to work. And so now what I can do is I can send that up to my client. So I'm going to say results equals client dot, and then there's a lot of different things that you could do, things like OCR, detecting objects, etc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say describe image in stream and then pass in the image. Now, you could go in and dig a little into the docs if you're curious about, everything that's available to you, all the information that's going to come back, and so forth. The key thing that I want to highlight here is the fact that it's going to give me a tags collection. And as you might expect, it's just going to be a list of words that could be used to tag this image. And so what I'm going to look inside of there for is the word dog, because if it's tagged as dog, that's going to tell me that there's a dog in there. So let's go ahead and set up a message equals no dog found, how sad. And then I'm going to say if tag in, if dog in result dot tags message equals you found or there's a dog. Beautiful. Okay. So there's going to be the message that we're then going to reply back with. Now, if you remember, I've actually already got a little thing that will work for me right here with our little message. So I could actually just rename this here to be result.html, and it'll work. Cool. Okay, let me yoink. And let me just put in my fancy style here. We'll just keep the same font. Okay, so let me go back to my app. I'm just going to, because I am live coding here, make sure that all of my code looks good. Get means we're going to send you the form, render template, form HTML, that looks good. On post, we're going to read in the file, that was called image. I did name it that looks good. Describe and stream, result tags, dog in there, dog, wonderful, result HTML message. Okay, cool. All right, so in theory, all of this should work just fine for me. Let's go ahead and find out. So let me close out my my window here. So it's going to say upload a picture, and we'll tell you if there is a dog. Bring up my browser window here. Cool, cool, cool. And so now, just sort of moving things around, let me go ahead and hit choose file, and there we go. And I want right here. That'll work. Okay, sorry. I had to go find a picture of my dog. I'm amazed I wasn't able to pull that up faster. Okay, so let me go ahead and do this real quick here. Let me upload that, and then I'm going to say send photo. And that will now upload. And sure enough, it's going to tell me there is a dog in the picture. And give me just 1 second here, and I'm just going to throw onto the browser window here the picture that I uploaded. So this was it. Oh, that's weird. Usually that's supposed to just open that up for me if I do a drag and drop. Fine, be that way. How about if I just do this then? There we go. So there is our beloved dog. That was the file that we uploaded, and so our cognitive services then came back and told us that there was a dog. So there it is. I also get to show off our lovely dog Roscoe, who sadly crossed the Rainbow Bridge about a year ago. He is deeply missed. We have a wonderful new dog though, Sammy, who's just an absolute blessing, but different conversation for a different time. I want to close all this out real quick by highlighting kind of two things. First of all, again, this flow here of we sent down the form on get, and then what we did was we sent the form down. On post, we took the image, sent that out to cognitive services, and then away we went from there. The second thing that I want to highlight is the fact that this is a very common, use case for Flask, where what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a front end for some service that's operating behind the scenes. That's really where this shines. Unlike some other platforms where things can kind of get in my way, Flask does what it's supposed to do and not a lot else. If I wanted to do other things, I can absolutely get it to do other things. There's a lot of great libraries that will extend that and so forth, which is great because then it can grow with me. But if what I'm looking for is just give me a web application, Flask will do exactly that for me. So with all of that, I want to thank you for tuning in. Again, my name is Christopher. You can come find me on social media. Check out the links to both the repository as well as to the other videos that we create. We're constantly creating new content over at the Reactors. So come on by, say hi, and we'll see you online sometime soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.